In the space of a few hundred years, between approximately 800 to 200 BC, there occurred developments in fundamental human thought, philosophical, religious, and scientific, that provided the intellectual, theological, and ideological foundations for every subsequent major civilization. Karl Jaspers, the Swiss philosopher, called this uniquely fertile time the axial period, and Eric Voegelin referred to it as the Great Leap of Being. Significantly, for those of us committed to freedom, Jaspers also described this period as a pause for liberty. This was the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu in China, of the transcription of the Vedas in India and the emergence of Buddhism, of Zoroaster in Persia, and of the Hebrew prophets in Israel, and the Greek philosophers in Greece and Asia Minor. The names from this period resonate with historical significance. Lao Tzu, Confucius, Siddhartha Gautama, Parmenides, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Elijah, Isaiah, Zoroaster, Jeremiah, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and many more. The intellectual explosions in these various areas and cultures seems to have taken place relatively independently of one another, yet the conditions giving rise to them and the social, political, religious, and intellectual effects resulting from them exhibit common elements. In India, China, and the Near East, the political condition was one of military struggle between small competing states, with resulting social dislocation and the upsetting of traditional modes of thought. We had the emergence of wandering scholars willing to teach all and sundry, Confucius in China and the Sophists in Greece, where before scholarship and learning had been the privilege of the political elite. And in each area we had the beginnings of commerce, marked and made possible by the creation of money and coinage. David Graeber argues that money and coinage created a division of spheres of human activity that endures to this day. Tempting as it is to wander along the highways of cultural, religious, and philosophical speculation, this temptation must be resisted. Our particular concern in these lectures is limited to the implications for political thought of the emergence of the Greek city-state, the polis, and the Greek wandering scholars, the Sophists. There are two extremes we can go to when looking at the past. One is to think of it as so different from the present that it can be understood, if at all, only by being viewed through the distorting lens of history, and to conclude that it can have no direct relevance to the issues that concern us today. The other is to think of the past as being in every respect concerned with the same issues as we are today, and to disregard the specific circumstances that obtained then. Greek political theory was inevitably conditioned by its time and its circumstances, yet the problems and issues it dealt with have trans-temporal significance. It is true, writes Ernest Barker, that political theory varies with the variations of the state. Aristotle's theory of the self-sufficient polis differs from Dante's theory of the universal empire, and Dante's theory of the empire from Hobbes's theory of the national state. Yet, through all its mutations, political theory has a fundamental unity. It is always occupied with the same problem, the problem of the relations of man to the state in which he lives. From about the 8th century BC, the characteristic form of social and political organization in Greece was the polis, or what is often called a city-state. These city-states emerged over a quite short period of time from what has sometimes been described as Dark Age chiefdoms. While these chiefdoms would, for the most part, have been based on kinship relations, the emergence of the polis did not involve the immediate triumph of territorial community identities over those of kinship. According to York Ferguson, the factors that contributed to the emergence of the predominantly territorially based polis were a felt need for a cultic centre and a dramatic increase in population, not unconnected to the change from a pastoral economy to one based on agriculture. There were many polis, and all of them were dynamic in their modes of political organisation. While in most of the polis the nobility had lost or been stripped of their legal and political privileges, they still retained enormous social power connected to their birth and their wealth. The basic tension within the polis, then, was between the men of birth and property, usually the few, and those of no social distinction and little wealth, usually the many. The struggle of the few and the many gave an impulse to the development of political theory in Greece in much the same way as popular revolts against monarchy have in modern times produced, or at any rate stimulated, political theories like that of the social contract. The class nature of politics was self-evident to the ancients. Oligarchy was a conspiracy of the rich to rob the poor, and democracy was a conspiracy of the poor to rob the rich. By modern standards, these polis were small in extent and small in population. Each polis had its own distinct ethos or character, and being as small as they were, they operated in an atmosphere of intimacy scarcely imaginable to us today. Again, in a way difficult for us to grasp, each polis was self-sufficient, or largely so, and from this self-sufficiency, self-governing. It is important to understand that the polis is not a city in the modern sense of that term, an urban complex, as distinct from a rural wilderness. It is rather an ethical fellowship, the purpose of which is the achievement of the excellence of the whole community. This is an alien notion for us moderns to grasp, when we find ourselves more often in conflict with the state and its officials and their aims than in sympathy with them, and when we would resent any attempt on the part of the state to interfere in what we consider to be our private affairs. Or at least some of us would. In part, this is because today we make a distinction not only between the individual and the state, but also a clear distinction between society and the state. These sharp distinctions either didn't exist for the Greeks, or if they did so only in a nascent way. While it is clearly impossible not to have some idea of an individual, the fact remains that in the political thought of Greece, the notion of the individual is not prominent. Society must be one with the state because there was no room for differentiation. We start with the individual and tend to view the state as having an essentially negative function of providing the basic conditions of peace and justice that allow us to get on with our private business. The Greeks, in their polis, on the other hand, living with other like-minded people, tended to see the function of the state as the furtherance of their common ethos. Despite having had kings at one stage in their development, the Greek polis were not, except accidentally and incidentally, despotisms in which the mass of the people were subjected to the capricious will of one man, as was the case in the neighbouring Persian Empire. They were rather fellowships. Because the notion of sovereignty is so central to modern and contemporary political thought, it is tempting to look for it in the world of the Greeks. We tend to see the sovereignty of the state as limited because we recognize other forms of sovereignty in individuals and in groups. But, as McClelland notes, the ancient Greeks did not think about sovereignty in that way because a distinction between public and private, in our sense, was not available to them. The polis, based on law, was above all other things designed to judge and control the characters of its members in the widest sense. The common purposes of the polis received attention in many ways, not least in their common public worship of the city's gods. This is another respect in which life in the classical world differed from ours. For us, religion is essentially a private and interior matter, and in most Western societies, apart from ceremonial occasions, it has little or no connection with the state. But for the ancients, religion dominated and permeated the life of the polis. All social activities had a religious significance. Ritual communal practices such as banquets and games produced social cohesion and also defined one's status as a citizen. The different polis were obliged to respect each other's shrines and religious sanctuaries, or the wrath of the gods would be visited upon the offenders. exclusion from the religious practices of the polis was tantamount to the loss of citizenship. In Athens, citizens considered themselves to be free to act as they wished in social matters and to have a say in the determination of the direction of the political community. They valued equality in different ways. Equality before the law, fundamental equality of regard for all as citizens, and equality in respect of freedom of speech. Not everyone was enthusiastic about this emphasis on freedom and political equality. Part of what Plato is doing in the Republic is the construction of his ideal city on a model not all that far removed from that provided by Sparta. For Plato, Sparta had the distinct advantage of having little or no truck with all this freedom nonsense, firmly subjugating the individual to the state and its goals. It is easy to be misled about the nature of Greek political life, and to think of it as being all of a piece with the way things were organized at Athens or Sparta. But there were many polis, and they all differed from each other. And as much as these polis differed from one another, they differed again from the Persian Empire and Egypt and Carthage and the various barbarian tribes living in the hinterland of civilized Greek-speaking world. Looking outward, the educated or travelled Athenian couldn't fail to be aware that customs, habits and laws differed, often widely, from society to society. Looking around him, an educated Athenian could hardly fail to appreciate the dramatic changes that had taken place even in his own polis in a relatively short period of time. The advent of Athenian democracy and its associated constitution was a recent historical event. George Sabine remarks that the final triumph of democracy was not much older than the political career of Pericles. The constitution itself went back only to the last years of the 6th century, and the beginning of the democracy, counting from the establishment of popular control over the courts by Solon, was less than a century older. It is also evident from the tragedies and comedies of the Greek playwrights that the Athenian public must have been well aware of the ongoing controversies and the continuing critical debate on all matters of politics. One particular way in which the Sophists differed from Plato and Aristotle was in their understanding of the relative importance of the individual and the polis. The Sophists started from the freedom of the individual, who had to be liberated from traditional religious and political legal bonds. For Plato and Aristotle, the polis was the great pedagogue, against which, strictly speaking, no natural subjective right of the citizen could be admitted. They acknowledged no goal of man that transcends the ideal polis. They remained state socialists. Now, there can be no denying that the sophists have a bad reputation. To be accused of sophistry is not to be complimented, and to have your reasoning described as sophistical is to have it damned for being speciously clever but wrong. Ordinary language use mirrors the more sophisticated, no pun intended, philosophical depreciation. In common speech, one can be a smart aleck, a know-it-all, a wise guy, too clever for one's own good, or too clever by half, or, in the case of Douglas Adams, too clever by 40%. The interpretation of the ideas of the Sophists is, perhaps, even more than most, controversial and disputed. This is so, not least, because of the paucity of first-hand material that survives. All we have are some fragments collected in the Dielskrantz authoritative edition of Fragmente der Vorsokratiker, translated in Kathleen Freeman's Ancilla to the Pre-Socratic Philosophers, the part of that work devoted to the Sophists amounting to a mere 37 pages. You can see why Max Salomon says, the picture of the individual sophists which we construct on the basis of such of their dicta as are preserved is, insofar as it is determined by the vicissitudes of the tradition, the result of pure chance. In the case of many of the sophists, we have to rely largely on the account given of them in Plato's dialogues, and the extent to which Plato was or wasn't biased in his portrayal of them is a matter of controversy. The Sophists didn't form a school of philosophy with distinctive doctrines, as later would be the case with the Epicureans, Cynics, and Stoics. Despite this, they shared a common interest in practical rather than theoretical matters, focusing their attention on ethics, politics, and education, rather than on physics or cosmology. Man, rather than the world around them, was their core concern. If they did have an attitude towards physics and cosmology, it was, in the main, skeptical. Despite this, methodologically they appear to share a similar approach to the physicists, or at least some of them did. Just as the early Greek physicists had attempted to find an underlying stable principle beneath the flux of change in the physical world around them, a principle which could explain and support these changes, so too some of the Sophists, keenly aware of the multiple and various social, political, and legal realities, sought to find an underlying practical principle that could explain and support the manifold social realities. It's one thing to agree that there must or might be some such principle. It's quite another thing to find it. The Sophists were first and foremost teachers of rhetoric, the art of persuasive public speaking. Why should public speaking be a worthwhile accomplishment? Well, because of the changed political circumstances in the Greek polis. With the social disturbances caused by war and the increasing cosmopolitanism of Athens resulting from its leadership of the Delian League, it had become readily apparent that laws differed from city to city, as did customs and habits. This cultural comparison disturbed settled convictions regarding law. Was there some settled human and social substratum or nature beneath all the various systems, or was it all merely a matter of convention? Entered the Sophists. These were men who undertook to teach various things: grammar, rhetoric, logic, ethics, and politics. What was new and revolutionary was not so much what they taught, but simply the fact that they taught at all. Some of the more prominent Sophists were Protagoras, Gorgias, Prodicus, Hippias, Antiphon, Callicles, Diagoras, Critias, Alcidamas, and Thrasymachus. With the exception of Antiphon, and Critias if he's to be considered a sophist, almost all of them were non-Athenians, attracted to Athens because it had become the intellectual centre of Greece and because of its wealth. Kerferd claims that we have the names of 26 or so sophists active between 460 and 380 BC. After this date, the individual sophists tended to be replaced by the various schools, such as the Academy of Plato and Aristotle's Lyceum. As itinerant teachers, the Sophists travelled all over the Greek world, visiting all the major cities. Almost all the Sophists visited Athens at one time or another between 460 to 400 BC. The increasingly dominant cultural position of Athens made it attractive, but, much more so, the wealth of its citizens. Given the developing nature of democracy in Athens and the possibilities opening to those able to control discussions of policy, the skills that the Sophists claimed to teach were extremely valuable. The Sophists, then, were responding to market demand. But they were also promoted by individual sponsorship, not least that of the great Pericles. According to Kerferd, it wasn't merely the general situation at Athens, but also the direct encouragement of Pericles that brought so many of the Sophists to Athens. Their coming was not simply something from without, but rather a development internal to the history of Athens. They were a part of the movement that was producing the new Athens of Pericles, and it was as such that they were both welcomed and attacked. Persuasion is not necessary where one can command. In a modern army, a general doesn't have to persuade his troops to obey his commands. He can simply coerce them. The shift in Greek society from a royal, through aristocratic to democratic structures meant that those who wished to be the determiners of public policy had to do so through persuasion. The prevalence of public speaking that leaves its traces everywhere in Greek literature indicates a fundamental shift in political consciousness away from a previous deference to powerful elites who were accountable to no one, and towards the self-conscious rejection of absolute authority by the masses of Greek citizens. It has sometimes been said that the major objection to the Sophists was that they charged money for what they taught. Part of the contempt of such as Plato for the Sophists appears to have been that they had the temerity to charge money for their services. Plato's aristocratic disdain for trade and commerce comes through strongly in such condemnation. However, given that other professions received payment for their services, doctors, poets, and artists, this objection seems somewhat specious. Perhaps it was their claim to teach wisdom and virtue that was problematic. Again, given that the Greek poets had been doing precisely this since time immemorial, the argument once again seems specious. Perhaps it was their teaching all and sundry that somehow compromised the integrity of the Sophists themselves, making them, as it were, the slaves of those they taught. Once again, it seems not. The evidence, as in Plato's Protagoras, suggests that the Sophists, though open in principle to anyone willing to pay, were in fact selective in their choice of students. What then is the objection? It's not that the Sophists expected to be paid, or what they taught, or the effect of their profession upon those that they taught. It was rather that they were willing to teach all and sundry, the low and base-born, as well as the noble and well-connected. All citizens might be equal in theory, but some citizens were more equal than others, and the more equal resented the Sophists. From the beginnings of Greek democracy in 507 BC, the question was, who gets to speak in the assembly and the council? Who makes the decisions? The answer was, of course, the citizens. But which citizens? As I mentioned already, despite the fact that the aristocracy had lost their legal and political privilege, they still retained enormous social power because of their wealth and birth, so that when money and birth talked, people listened. The art of the sophist, by threatening to empower the poor and the poorly born, was a direct challenge to the power and influence of the aristocracy. It's not coincidental that, although sophistry did not begin in Athens, the rise of Athenian democracy and the emergence of the sophists to prominence go hand in hand. A key incident that illustrates the fact that there was one law for the aristocracy and another for the peasant comes not from history but from literature. At the siege of Troy, when Agamemnon, to test the morale of the Greeks, lets it be known that he is about to lift the siege of Troy and order a return home, is unpleasantly surprised to find both officers and men only too ready to take to the ships. Odysseus undertakes to stem the rout. He cajoles the other kings and chieftains into returning to duty with mild and persuasive language. But he sternly rebukes and physically assaults the common soldiers, bidding them to listen to better men than themselves, telling them that they cannot all be kings and that one king must be supreme. When Thersites, a common soldier, has the temerity to rebuke Agamemnon and to counsel an end to the pointless war, Odysseus strikes him to the ground with his staff and rebukes him with these words: "Check your glib tongue, Thersites. Drop this chatter about kings, and neither revile them nor keep harping about going home." Thersites' protest is, says I. F. Stone, the debut of the common man in written history, the first exercise of free speech by a commoner against a king, and it is suppressed by force. Odysseus answers the speech not by argument but with a beating. The methods of teaching employed by the sophists included not only the set-piece lecture, but instruction by means of question and answer. If this method sounds familiar, it's because it is the method commonly known as Socratic. Did this method predate Socrates? Some, such as Diogenes Laertius, say that Protagoras was the first to use this method. This claim has generated much heat among those leaping to the defense of the originality of Socrates, but without going into tedious detail, we can, I think, agree with Kerford, who says, the Socratic method, to the extent that it may have originated with Socrates, nonetheless originated from within the sophistic movement, if only because Socrates himself was a part of that movement. Was Socrates a sophist? Given the hostility of Plato to sophists as a whole, surely this is a nonsensical suggestion. Whether nonsensical or not, it's clear that Socrates appeared to be indistinguishable from Sophist to many of his contemporaries. Kerford remarks, "It is thus clear that Socrates was quite widely regarded as part of the sophistic movement. His intellectual and educational impact on the aspiring young men at Athens was such that in function he was correctly so regarded. The fact that he took no payment does not alter his function in any way."